Imagine a time long, long ago, when some people had so much power they could make everyone around them afraid. These were not good people. They were often very mean, doing terrible things to get their way and stay in charge. They thought they were kings of the world, that no one could ever stop them. They built big armies, lived in fancy palaces, and made rules that hurt many. For a long time it seemed like nothing could touch them. They walked around with proud smiles, believing they were stronger than anyone, that their power would last forever and ever. But here's a secret, a very important one. Even the biggest bullies, the meanest rulers, and the scariest tyrants eventually face their own ending. And often, these endings are not grand and glorious like they thought they would be. Instead, their last days can be very surprising, even dark and sad. It's like a spooky story, where the bad guy, who seemed unbeatable, suddenly finds himself in a very bad spot. Think of it like this. A big scary dragon might fly around, breathing fire and making everyone tremble. But even a dragon gets old, or makes a mistake, or finds itself in a tight corner where all its fire and roar can't save it. These powerful rulers, who made so many suffer, often met their end in ways they never expected. Sometimes, they were alone, scared, and very, very sad. Sometimes, the people who were once their friends turned against them. Sometimes, they died not in a big battle, but quietly, or in a hidden place, far from the crowds they once ruled. We often hear about how these tyrants started, how they got all their power, and all the terrible things they did. But what about their very last days? What was it like when the world started to turn against them, when their mighty castles began to crumble, and their loyal followers began to disappear? These are the stories we don't always hear, the hidden parts of history that are both chilling and fascinating. They show us that no matter how much power someone has, or how much fear they spread, everyone, absolutely everyone, has an end. And for these very bad people, their endings were often full of worry, loneliness, and a deep gnawing fear that they had made for others for so long. It's a powerful lesson that even the most wicked hearts can feel the cold touch of fear when their time finally comes. These tales are not just about scary endings. They are about understanding that even when someone seems like they can never be stopped, there is always a final chapter. And sometimes, that final chapter is the most important one, showing us the true cost of their cruel choices. It's a peek behind the curtain of history, revealing the hidden moments when these powerful monsters faced their own personal nightmares. As we peer into these hidden final chapters, let's start with a name many know: Adolf Hitler. For years, he was a man who roared, who made grand speeches, and who led a terrible war that hurt millions. He believed he was a god, that his plans were perfect, and that his power would last 1,000 years. But as the war turned against him, as his armies were pushed back, his grand dreams began to shrink, just like a balloon losing air. His world became very small, very quickly. Instead of grand palaces, Hitler found himself deep underground, in a dark, cold place called the Führerbunker. It was a concrete box, buried beneath the streets of a city that was falling apart, day by day, under a rain of bombs. Imagine living in a tiny, crowded basement, with no windows to see the sky, only thick walls that vibrated with the sounds of war above. This was his home, in his final days. Inside this bunker, the once mighty leader was not mighty at all. He was like a trapped animal. His body was shaking, his hands trembled, and his voice, once so strong, was often just a whisper. He was very sick and very tired. The proud smile he once wore was gone, replaced by a scowl of anger and deep fear. He spent his time pacing back and forth, looking at maps that showed his enemies getting closer and closer. Every loud noise, every distant explosion, made him jump. He thought everyone was against him, even the people who were still trying to help him. This feeling that everyone was out to get him is called paranoia, and it filled his mind like a dark cloud. He would shout at his generals, blaming them for everything that went wrong, even though he was the one who made most of the bad choices. He would order armies that no longer existed to fight battles they couldn't win. It was like a bad dream where he was still trying to play a game, but all his pieces were gone. The grand plans he once had were just whispers in the dark, forgotten as reality crashed down around him. Outside the bunker, the city was burning. The sounds of guns and bombs were constant, but inside Hitler was stuck in his own world of make-believe. He ate his last meals in silence, surrounded by a few frightened people. He even married a woman named Eva Braun in those last hours. A strange and quiet ceremony in the middle of all the chaos. It was a wedding without joy, only a desperate attempt to cling to something normal as his world ended. Finally, on April 30, 1945, with enemy soldiers just a few streets away, Hitler knew there was no escape. He did not go out in a blaze of glory, leading his troops, as he might have once dreamed. Instead, he went into a small room in the bunker, with Eva Braun, and took his own life. It was a lonely, quiet and very sad end for a man who had caused so much noise and pain in the world. His body was quickly burned, so there would be no grand funeral, no final resting place for people to visit. Just ashes, scattered and forgotten, like the last embers of his terrible reign. His final moments were not about power or victory, but about fear, defeat, and a chilling quiet. While Hitler's end was a dark, hidden whisper in a crumbling bunker, the fate of another powerful tyrant unfolded very differently, far from the shadows. His name was Benito Mussolini, the strongman leader of Italy, and his final days were a frantic race, a desperate attempt to escape the angry people he had once ruled. Like Hitler, Mussolini had once strutted with pride, filling town squares with roaring speeches and grand promises. He had called himself Il Duce, meaning the leader, and for many years Italians either loved him or feared him greatly. He believed he was building a new Roman Empire, a powerful nation that would stand tall. But just like Hitler's dreams, Mussolini's grand visions began to crack, as the war turned bad for him and his country. Italy became a battlefield, and the people grew tired of war, hunger, and the iron fist of their leader. As the enemy armies pushed into Italy, and his own people started to fight against him, Mussolini's power vanished like smoke. He was no longer the proud leader. He was a man running for his life, trying to find a hole to hide in. In the spring of 1945, with the war ending and his enemies closing in from all sides, Mussolini knew his time was up. He gathered a small group of his most loyal followers, including his girlfriend, Clara Petacci, and tried to flee. He dressed up in a German army coat, putting on a helmet, and trying to blend in with a convoy of German soldiers who were also trying to escape. Imagine a once proud leader, famous for his big speeches and fancy uniforms, now trying to sneak away in a borrowed soldier's coat, hoping no one would recognize him. It was a sad and silly disguise for a man who had once demanded all eyes be on him. They traveled through the mountains, a long and bumpy ride, full of fear and quick glances over their shoulders. Every shadow seemed to hold a danger. Every sound made them jump. But his luck had run out. On April 27, 1945, their convoy was stopped by Italian fighters who were against him. These fighters were looking for anyone trying to escape, and they quickly found Mussolini hiding in the back of a truck. His disguise didn't work. The man who had ruled Italy for over 2 decades was caught, not in a heroic battle, but in a dusty truck, trying to run away. The next day, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were taken to a small village, and, after a quick judgment by the resistance fighters, they were shot. But their story didn't end there. Unlike Hitler, whose body was burned and hidden, Mussolini's fate was far more public and shocking. Their bodies, along with the bodies of some of his other followers, were brought to a big square in Milan, a city where he had once given many proud speeches. There, in Piazzale Loreto, a place where Mussolini's own forces had once displayed the bodies of executed resistance fighters, his body and Clara's were hung upside down from a metal girder at a gas station. A huge, angry crowd gathered. People shouted, threw things, and showed their disgust for the man who had caused them so much pain. It was a harsh and terrible end, a public shaming that showed the deep hatred the Italian people had for their fallen tyrant. His last moments were not only filled with fear of capture, but also with the ultimate humiliation, a stark contrast to the glory he had always sought. It was a powerful, brutal message that even the most feared leaders cannot escape the anger of a wronged people. From the public shame of Mussolini to the hidden despair of Hitler, we now turn to a tyrant whose end was shrouded in even more mystery and fear. Joseph Stalin. For over 30 years, Stalin ruled a vast country with an iron fist, making everyone, from the smallest farmer to the highest general, tremble at his name. He was called Man of Steel, and he built his power on fear, sending millions to harsh prison camps, or even to their deaths. No one dared to question him, and his picture was everywhere, showing him as a wise and strong leader, a father to his people. But behind the strong image, Stalin was a deeply suspicious man, especially in his later years. He saw enemies everywhere, even among his closest friends and advisors. His home, a grand country house called a dacha, became a place of silence and dread. His staff and guards lived in constant terror, knowing that one wrong look or one mistaken word could lead to their disappearance. This fear wasn't just for the common people. It gripped even the most powerful men who worked with him. They knew that Stalin could turn on anyone, at any time, for any reason. As he grew older, Stalin became even more unpredictable. He would invite his top advisors to long, late-night dinners that often turned into scary games. They would drink and laugh, but beneath the surface everyone was on edge, waiting for Stalin's mood to change. He enjoyed watching them squirm, knowing they were terrified of him. These advisors, men who held great power themselves, were like scared children around him, always trying to guess what he wanted, always afraid of making a mistake. Then, in early March 1953, something strange happened. Stalin had spent the evening with his closest advisors, as usual. They left him late at night, supposedly well. But the next morning he didn't wake up. His guards, who were not allowed to disturb him unless he called, waited and waited. The hours ticked by, and still, no sound came from his room. Imagine the fear in their hearts. If they went in without permission, they could be killed. If they didn't, and something was wrong, they could also be killed. It was a terrible choice. Finally, after many hours, a guard bravely entered the room. He found Stalin on the floor, unable to move or speak. He had suffered a stroke, a sudden illness that had paralyzed him. But here's where the mystery deepens. His terrified advisors, when finally called, were slow to act. Some historians believe they were secretly glad to see him ill, or perhaps they were too afraid to get a doctor, fearing Stalin would accuse them of trying to poison him. It took many hours for proper medical help to arrive, and even then, the doctors were scared to treat him, knowing that if he died, they might be blamed. For several days, Stalin lay dying, a helpless old man on a bed, no longer the terrifying Man of Steel. His powerful advisors stood by, some pretending to be sad, others perhaps secretly relieved. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin finally died, but the questions remained. Was his death truly natural, or did the fear he created, the fear that paralyzed his closest men, contribute to his slow demise? His end was not a public spectacle like Mussolini's, nor a hidden suicide like Hitler's. It was a slow, agonizing fade, surrounded by people who were too scared to help him, a chilling testament to the reign of terror he had built. His death was a silent, anxious relief for many, but also a lingering shadow of suspicion that marked the end of his terrible rule. We've seen the fiery collapse of Hitler, the public humiliation of Mussolini, and the fearful, mysterious end of Stalin. Now, let's look at a lesser-known but equally brutal tyrant named Pol Pot. His reign of terror took place in a country far away, called Cambodia, in the 1970s. Pol Pot and his followers, known as the Khmer Rouge, had a terrible idea of how to run a country. They wanted to turn everyone into farmers, and destroy all modern things. They forced people out of cities, killed those who wore glasses or spoke other languages, and caused millions to die from hunger, sickness, or murder. He was a quiet, almost shy man, but his actions were monstrous. Unlike the others, Pol Pot's end wasn't a sudden fall or a quick capture. It was a long, drawn-out fade, like a terrible play that slowly loses its audience. His regime, or time in power, ended when a neighboring country, Vietnam, invaded Cambodia in 1979 and pushed his forces out of the capital city. But even after losing his main power, Pol Pot didn't disappear completely. He and his remaining followers retreated into the thick jungles along the border, becoming a small hidden army. For nearly 2 decades after his fall from power, Pol Pot lived a strange, isolated life. He was no longer the supreme leader of a nation, but a leader of a small, forgotten group of fighters. He moved from one hidden camp to another, always hiding, always trying to stay one step ahead of those who wanted to catch him. The world mostly forgot about him, or perhaps wished he would just vanish. He was a ghost of his former self, a man still dreaming of a terrible past, while the rest of the world moved on. As the years passed, even his own followers began to turn on him. The Khmer Rouge, his once loyal army, started to crumble from the inside. There were fights, betrayals, and executions within his own ranks. Imagine a king whose kingdom has shrunk to just a few weary soldiers, and even they are fighting among themselves. Pol Pot, the man who had ordered so many deaths, now faced betrayal from those he trusted most. In 1997, his own comrades, tired of his leadership and the endless fighting, put him on trial. It wasn't a big, fancy trial with lawyers and judges, but a jungle court, where his own men accused him of being a bad leader. They sentenced him to house arrest, which meant he was kept in a small hut in the jungle, guarded by his former soldiers. The man who had once commanded a whole nation was now a prisoner in his own small world. He couldn't leave, couldn't give orders, and had no real power. He died in that isolated hut in April 1998, at the age of 72. The cause of his death was said to be heart failure, though some still wonder if it was truly natural. There was no big announcement, no grand funeral. His body was cremated, or burned, on a pile of old tires and rubbish, a humble and sad end for a man who had caused so much suffering. His death was a quiet flicker in the jungle, largely unmourned and unmarked, a stark contrast to the massive impact he had on his country. Pol Pot's final days were a slow, lonely retreat from power, ending in a forgotten hut, far from the spotlight he once commanded. A chilling lesson in how even the most brutal reigns can end, not with a bang, but with a whimper. We have journeyed through the final, frightening days of some of history's most terrible leaders. From the echoing halls of power to the cold, dark corners where their stories ended, a pattern emerges, clear as a bell. These men, who once stood so tall and cast such long shadows, all shared a common thread in their last moments. A bitter taste of their own cruel medicine. One of the strongest threads is isolation. Think of Hitler, alone in his bunker, cut off from the world, surrounded by only a handful of people who were as trapped and scared as he was. His grand empire had shrunk to a few concrete rooms. Even Stalin, in his dacha, was surrounded by people too terrified to truly be close to him, leaving him alone in his final helpless state. Pol Pot, too, ended his days in a jungle hut, a prisoner in his own small world, far from the millions he once controlled. These men, who demanded so much attention and loyalty, found themselves truly alone when their power slipped away. Then there is fear. These tyrants had used fear as their greatest weapon, making millions tremble. But in their final days the tables turned. Hitler was consumed by paranoia, seeing enemies everywhere, jumping at every bomb blast. Mussolini fled in disguise, shaking with the fear of capture. Stalin's advisors were so scared of him that they hesitated to help, perhaps even fearing for their own lives if they acted too quickly. And Pol Pot, hunted and betrayed, must have lived with a constant dread of being caught. The very emotion they inflicted on others became their constant companion. Betrayal also played a big part. Mussolini was captured by his own countrymen, the very people he had once led. Stalin's own inner circle, though they didn't directly betray him, certainly didn't rush to his aid, perhaps silently wishing for his end. And Pol Pot was actually put on trial and held captive by his own former soldiers, men who had once followed his every command. This is a bitter irony. Those who rule through fear often find that loyalty is a fragile thing, easily broken when their power wanes. Most striking of all is the stark contrast to the power they once wielded. These men had commanded armies, controlled vast lands, and made decisions that changed the world. Hitler, the master of propaganda, ended in a suicide that was hidden from the world. Mussolini, who loved grand public displays, was hung upside down like an animal in a public square. Stalin, the man of steel, lay helpless and ignored, while his fate hung in the balance of his terrified staff. And Pol Pot, the architect of a monstrous revolution, died quietly, his body burned on a pile of trash. Their lives were about total control and absolute power, but their deaths were about loss of control, helplessness, and often, public humiliation, or lonely obscurity. The mighty had fallen, not with the grand, dramatic endings they might have imagined, but with whimper and dread. These common threads weave a powerful message. No matter how high one climbs on the ladder of power, or how cruelly they treat others, the end often brings a chilling, humbling reckoning, a mirror reflecting the very suffering they caused. As we close the book on the chilling final days of these powerful tyrants, a big lesson shines through, clear and bright. It's a lesson about power itself, how it can be so strong one moment and then, in a blink, disappear like a puff of smoke. These men, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, and Pol Pot, each thought they were invincible, that their rule would last forever. They held the lives of millions in their hands, made grand plans, and demanded absolute obedience. They were like towering giants, casting long shadows over the world. But our journey into their final moments shows us something important. Power is like a strong wind. It can lift you up high, but it can also blow you away, leaving you stranded and small. Even the most ruthless people, those who seem to have no heart or fear, eventually face their own end. And for these terrible leaders, their endings were rarely grand or glorious. Instead, they were often humbling, full of fear, loneliness, and sometimes very horrifying. Think about it. Hitler, the man who wanted to conquer the world, ended up hiding in a cold, dark hole, taking his own life. Mussolini, who loved to stand before cheering crowds, was publicly shamed and displayed like a common criminal. Stalin, the man of steel who made everyone tremble, lay helpless and alone, perhaps even hastened to his end by the very fear he created. And Pol Pot, the quiet monster, died forgotten in a jungle hut, betrayed by his own. These stories are not just old tales from history books. They are reminders that no one is above the consequences of their actions. They show us that true strength is not found in making others afraid, but in kindness and justice. The power these tyrants held was a false power, built on cruelty and lies. And like all things built on shaky ground, it eventually crumbled. Their ends were not peaceful. They were filled with the very things they made others suffer: fear, isolation, and often a desperate scramble for survival. They faced a reckoning, a moment when their mighty grip on the world loosened, and they were left with nothing but their own terror. It's a sobering thought, that even those who caused the most pain, who seemed to escape justice for so long, could not escape the ultimate, humbling truth, that their time, like everyone else's, would run out. So as we remember these chilling stories, let them be a lesson for all of us. Let them remind us that power is a gift, not a right, and that how we use it truly matters. For in the end, even the darkest of hearts must face the dawn, and for history's most ruthless tyrants, that dawn often brought not light, but a horrifying, humbling darkness of their own making.